Hey Arthur.
Hello, Rojita. How are you today?
Good, how are you?
I'm pretty fine, thank you.
Great. You can hear me properly? Audio is clear? Everything is
Yeah,
fine?
absolutely.
Great. And I like your setup in the back. I see a lot of tasting bottles. Yeah, it's good. So your office is open now.
My office is open. Well, it's only me there, but yeah, it's open.
Paul says hi. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Paul.
People are
Hello.
still, yeah, people are still joining in. So how are things? You are in
Well,
the border of Switzerland and Austria, right? That's where you live.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Um,
So
well, the
is it
borders are
slightly
shut.
confusing?
It is slightly confusing. I have a Swiss company and I live in Austria, um, but not at all.
Yeah. Okay. Uh, I'm just trying to a little. Yes, I think this is better. Okay, perfect. So, um, so today we are going to talk about gin. I know that you specialize in a lot of spirits, not just gin. You specialize with grappa, araki, and then rum, and of course absinthe. And thank you so much for agreeing to be with Drinks and Destinations Insta Live today. This is your second time with the Drinks and Destinations show. First one was with the Drinks and Destinations podcast, which was really good. I remember that was a very nice episode.
It
So
was
thank you
great
for,
being it. Yeah.
yeah, it was quite nice. Yes, so we are going to talk about gin. And you know that gin has been around for centuries. It also made a comeback recently. So let's start with the origin of gin. Where exactly did it start? And how is the evolution of gin trend that happened all over the world?
Well, I think if we talk about evolution of gin, we are not getting around the Dutch because actually it all started with the Dutch people. So they used to do something just with juniper and a little bit of coriander, and I think there are lots of stories around that, but it's been mainly the Brits that went into the. It's been one of those Spanish-Dutch successor wars when some Brits joined in as soldiers, and that's where they get in touch with the juniper spirit, and they took it home. So that's the origins of the whole thing.
Mhm. So, but
Later on,
some Sorry, yeah. Some
sorry,
text
no, no.
says that it started in Belgium and the Netherlands, and that's when the Britishers, during the war or something, they basically discovered gin and they took it back to England. So it's almost
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
story. Yeah.
That's short story. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's originating with the Dutch and the Belgium. That's absolutely right. And it's not been made with with pure ethanol, but it's been made on a grain basis, like
Hmm.
new make whiskey.
Hmm. Like vodka, actually, you can say. I mean, the base spirit
No,
could be
that's now. But in former
okay.
times, when we talk about that old spirit, it used to be a double distilled grain, like the basis for
Hmm.
a single malt whiskey. And
Hmm.
then they simply distill the third time with juniper and with coriander and a little bit of citrus peels.
Okay. So when it comes to the types and styles of gins, what are the basic rules that has to be followed when you're making a gin?
Well, nowadays it's quite clear. In Europe, it's quite clear. Each country or each big country has its own legislation, like Europe and the US. I'm pretty sure India has its own legislation too. But in Europe, you need to have really pure ethanol. So you start on a base like with vodka, and
Mhm.
then you add your ingredients. And the law is quite clear. It says juniper is the predominant aroma in gin. So that's
Mhm.
also something within the last years we are seeing more and more vanishing, but junipers should be quite strong and intense.
So in the 18th century, um, Was gin made in the same exact way, the way it's being made now, or has there been any major changes in terms of the gin production styles and type?
That's a good question. Well, what we know from ancient books is that the origins of gin in and around London was quite cumbersome, and it all came from Willem III of Orange, that became a Belgian guy that became king of the Brits, and
Mhm.
he forbade cognac. So people asked him, "So what shall we drink?" Because cognac was the preferred drink those days, and he said, "Well, if you can't afford to drink cognac, then drink gin."
Gin.
So,
Okay.
well, the original product was called Geneva, and
Mm.
it's believed that they shortened it because a Brit can't really spell Geneva right, so it's a shortening. So they shortened it to gin over the years, and they didn't know what's inside. They just knew it's greenish, and old recipes show they had awful stuff in. They even
Mhm.
added in pea instead of water. So the
Ew.
beginnings weren't that easy, and they had about 200 years, which went into history, which are called gin craze, because gin was in certain times cheaper than bread. So that was that was a dark time for Britain, especially for London. You have to imagine there were about 7,500 gin shops pouring gin with literally
Wow.
no VAT or tax on it. So they started they started putting on taxes to keep people away from gin. Even in those times, terpene was part of the recipe to bring
Mhm.
that greenish notes in. So there is one famous painting, and you should refer to that and Google that. William Hogarth uh, painted something called Gin Lane, and it pictures quite perfectly a street scene from that time. Actually, he painted two paintings. One is called Gin Lane, which
Mhm.
should shock people away from gin, and the other one is
Oh,
called Beer Lane, which shows proper and drink beer drinking people. And
yeah.
in Gin Lane, you see the church breaking down. Death stands in the back of the picture with the sense.
Mhm.
Um, people were drunk, and that was horrible times, and it
And the
lasted for
distilleries
almost.
used to be located inside the city, right? At that point of time in London, everywhere the distilleries were, I mean, basically all over the
Mhm.
place. There
Absolutely,
was
yeah.
no restriction as such. Yeah.
In the beginning, no. Later on, there were much and much more restrictions. They put up tax, they put on higher tax. You had to buy licenses to sell gin, all just to keep people away from drinking booze all day.
Yeah, of course. So, when did they actually decide different styles of gins? And, I mean, because obviously initially when they started, it was just juniper and few botanicals which were added. But when was the clear definition of gin styles that you can find in record? Oh,
Well, I mean, the first sign of a second type of gin goes into the 1700s, when you find first records of something called Old Tom gin. And those Old
yeah.
Tom gin was obviously sweetened with licorice, because they didn't have sugar at that time. So it was heavily sweetened with licorice. And
Hmm.
that was a separate style besides the very dry and possibly terpene containing gin at that time.
Mm.
And nowadays, um, well, but by law, there are certain styles. In Europe, you can produce gin, distilled gin, and dry gin. And the idea behind is simply by differentiating if you add anything after distillation. If you're not adding on anything, it's a dry gin. If you
Yeah.
add on something after distillation, like you add some flower pods after distillation, then we may call it distilled gin.
Hmm.
And if it's just carrying the name gin on the bottle, it might also be just vodka and some essences stirred twice and bottled.
Mhm.
Must not be a bad thing, but definitely nothing crafty.
Yeah. And when did I mean, I know right now craft gins are a huge thing. Organic gins are a huge thing. So all this
Absolutely.
started in what? In last 1 decade or so?
Absolutely. I mean, if we look at gin at the moment, here in German language areas in Europe or even in mainland Europe, people, like you asked in the beginning, believe that the gin hype's already going down. If you look at
Right.
the numbers, it's not. But we see that gin hype for almost 15 years now here in Europe, and it's not everywhere the same. So it seems it all started for this last hype in Spain, and then went through the German language areas and now returning back to Britain. Because if you look at the numbers in Britain, it's only for the last 3-4 years that they really go up and up. So
Mhm.
our gin hype might be in the end, possibly in Britain,
It
it's
is. In India, it's a huge
it's
thing
in the
now.
top. In India, it's a big thing, like I discovered last time.
Hmm. Yeah. And did
And
you
I'm
try any
pretty
of the
sure.
Indian?
Well, wait, something. I'm pretty sure gin is here to stay.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a positive note for gin's future, you see. What is
Absolutely.
slow gin?
Well, actually, slow gin is something that comes out of history. If you look, I know you've been to Britain before. If
Yes.
you wander around the countryside in autumn, you find sloes. Sloe is a very old. Actually, it's one of the oldest kind of prunes. It's
Mhm.
the first prune thing. It's very small, and people harvest it. They picked it, and they have a quite thick skin. So they took needles or something like that and pushed into the skin, and then they simply put it into a big jar with gin and let it rest
Mhm.
for 5, 6, 7 months before they took out the sloes again and had a proper drink. And actually, they obviously added in some sugar. So that's
Mhm.
the idea behind sloe gin. And it's not allowed here in Europe to call gin. That's very interesting. Actually, it's a liqueur based on gin. There are now
Mhm.
its own regulations. There is a minimum ABV for sloe gin. It needs to have 25 ABV.
Okay.
But beside that, there are several on the market, and you can pick some very great ones and some not so great ones.
I think the most popular one is Monkey 47. It's Monkey 47
Well,
is
internationally
slow.
seen, Monkey
Yeah.
47 does a great thing. Yeah, they do a great
Yeah.
slow gin. Must add in that the German language distillers have a certain different idea of a slow gin than the original British ones. As mostly people did it at home and it rested in
Mhm.
jars for months. In Britain, if you focus on slow gin, it's more on the oxidized side, like if you look at port or
Oh,
sherry.
okay.
Here, where we have fruit distillers in the German language areas, they really want spot on a fresh prune fruit and some
Mhm.
acidity in. So that's quite a difference.
Mhm. So now that we are talking about gin and styles, let's have our tasting, which we decided that we're going to do today online.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
my bottle of Hendrix gin. It's one of my
I got one
favorites,
here as well.
actually.
Yeah, it's a
Great,
very nice
awesome.
gin. It's a very nice gin,
It,
and I think
yeah.
it was one of here in Europe. It was one of those gins that came along with that first hype. So
Hmm.
10, 12 years ago, Hendrix is about 12 years old now as a
Yeah.
brand here in Europe.
So
So
yeah,
what do you like? What do you like on that product? You said it's one of your favorites.
I think it's the uh, I think that obviously besides the juniper, it's the citrus notes which are prominent. But I also like the finish of cucumber, which is the signature of Hendrix actually, and the hint of rose petals, as they say, which is
Absolutely.
actually there in the bottle. You can feel
I
that
mean, to
on the
be
nose.
fair, to be honest, this is it's a very complex gin.
It is. Yeah.
You already mentioned, yeah, the Bulgarian rose flowers and and the cucumber, and people always think it must be very pungent and intense, but
Mhm.
it's not. It's very discreet, but it's there. You find the cucumber combined with the rose petals, and there's a lot more
So,
in. I mean, you have lemon peels and orange
yes,
peels,
the citrus note is quite prominent.
and it's
So
not
when you're
only
tasting
rose.
it, sorry, when you're tasting good gin, uh, what is the signs that you're looking at? Because there are a lot of bad gins also in the market, and I mean, as you know, that sometimes there is hardly any juniper that you find in some gins. So, what are the things that you should be looking at when you're picking up a bottle of gin or tasting gin? How do you know it's great?
Well, I think that's one of the most common asked questions to me and possibly to you as well, as we both
Yeah, of
judge
course.
competitions.
Yeah.
Um, and people constantly ask, why is it good or bad? But I think it's not only that line between good and bad, but it's also a second line from, is it classic or modern? I mean,
Hmm.
you just can't say, is it good or bad? I mean, if we focus on, is it good? Obviously, it must be balanced. Nothing should stand out, and the alcohol must be quite clean. I mean, we both had products before when you had a bad taste of the raw alcohol, or
Yeah.
when you have coriander sticking out, getting that soapiness, almost cheesiness, when you have too much of coriander. So it must be balanced, it must be clean, and it must be expressive. I think that's
Hmm.
something that decides between is it good or bad. And then to go further, you need some information about the gin itself. Is it a classic dry gin, or is it like we in Europe call it new Western style gin? That's something which is absolutely opposite of what gin shall be. The less
What is
juniper,
it?
well, uh, new Western style is something almost lacking juniper, but having lots of fruit, citrus, flowers, and that's very, very, very. People like it. It goes through the
Hmm.
roof. So I mean, um, market shares are growing on the new Western style, not on the classical stuff, and that's an ongoing discussion. Um, I got sent last week 25 South African gins to to try to give my opinion, and about half of them I told them, well, for me this is not proper gin. There is no juniper in. I said, well,
Hmm.
at least half of them you tell us it's not proper gin are selling best, and
Hmm.
that's something that gives me headaches.
Because
I mean, if
maybe
people
because
tell,
people don't know what is a good gin. I mean, they have never tasted it. They don't know exactly how gin should be, probably.
I think they are already a step ahead. I got really answers like, you know, I like this gin because I don't like juniper. And if you get such an answer, there's something wrong, you
Obviously.
know.
Yeah,
But
that's funny.
we divided. I mean, competitions. We divided into modern and dry, because London dry or dry commonly is a very juniper forward thing, and modern styles uh, is the modern stuff, like very fruity, lots of citrus. I think Hendrix,
So,
which we have in the glass, is somewhere balanced in the middle.
yeah.
It still has that. There is juniper all over, and then there are add-ons, like there is citrus, there is flowers, there is some other spices, and I think that's what make Hendrix one of the premium gins of these days.
Yeah. So Lala is asking, of all the gin that you have tasted, what must you find particularly to qualify as a good gin?
What must you find? Juniper,
Juniper? The
absolutely.
gin which has a juniper forward note in it,
Yeah,
basically.
for
Yeah.
me, yes. I mean, you can see in the back there is my there's my enrollment
Yes.
for the Gin Guild, And like my friend Bernhard, you also know, we
Yeah.
had to swear on the juniper. So we're the hardliners.
Yeah, you want the raw basic stuff. I mean, first you build your gin with the strong juniper note, then you add botanicals which could just complement the juniper. I think that makes sense actually. Rather
It
than
does.
going, overboard with other botanicals, the first focus should be your good quality juniper on the base, isn't it?
Definitely. And that's something you always must focus on the quality of your botanicals. There is no way around that you source fresh and, well, fresh. We mostly talk about dried botanicals, but they need to be spot on quality and fresh. I mean, you can buy a certain juniper in cooking shops by the lot, and then you open the bag and you smell in, and you got a very oily and almost rancid aroma because it's old. So that's not something you can use for a proper gin, because that will carry over into the gin and they have a rancid gin. So it need to be high quality base materials.
Okay, now let's taste it. I think we should because
Always again, I think it's very mouth filling.
yeah,
It's quite
it's
quite
very
pronounced.
complex.
It
Yeah.
is. It's a little bit peppery. I mean, you get that peppery note from the juniper. There's the freshness of the citrus.
Yeah,
There's some soft coriander in the back even that gives it
yeah.
a lingering smell. So if you say
I
this
think
is
I get
your
strong
favorite,
coriander notes.
you think you get
Wow.
strong coriander notes or
Yeah,
you
and when
don't?
you add a little bit of water, you
Yeah,
get that pepperiness just jumps out of the glass.
absolutely, absolutely.
It's too strong. I never actually experienced so much of pepper on the Hendrix, bottle ever. I mean, this is
Well,
the first time I'm actually getting that on the, maybe it's a glass, uh,
it's a
standard
no.
tasting glass. No?
Well, I just have one without stems.
Okay.
Sorry. Um, I mean, that's a twofold thing. The pepperiness can come from the juniper, but also if you go a bit deeper into the recipe of Hendrix, there is cubeb pepper in. So there actually is
Okay.
pepper in.
Yeah. So talking about this particular brand, it's bottled in Scotland, which is a very interesting thing because uh, it's bottled in Scotland with 44% alcohol, and obviously it's handcrafted gin. It's
Yours
one
is
of those,
44. May I ask? Yours is 44?
yeah, it says 44% alcohol.
Okay,
How much is
because
yours?
mine is 41.4.
Really? How
Yeah.
is that possible?
Well,
That's
possibly they make
interesting.
a difference. Possibly they make a
See,
difference between
it says
European and
44.
cool. Okay, handcrafted. They add some
Handcrafted. Yeah,
more.
you never know.
They add some more water for the Europeans.
Yeah. And maybe Indians wanted to have some, but I remember picking it up from a duty free. So maybe this is for duty free. The alcohol percentage is slightly higher than the local market where you picked it
Yeah,
up, possibly.
that's possible. That's possible. I mean,
So what are the,
if you talk about Scotland, I mean, in the meantime, the Scots claim there are more gin distilleries in Scotland than in Britain. And it's not only the big ones. I mean, even Gordon's is made in Scotland, and Hendrix
Mhm.
belongs to Grants, which is part of Glenfiddich and the whole
Yeah,
stuff. So, I mean, gin in Scotland comes from the history, but it also is a big part of the future. I'm pretty sure you know about the lots of small scale and craft whiskey distilleries opening within the last years, and not only in
yes.
Scotland but also in Britain. Those distilleries not only do whiskey, because if you start producing whiskey, you have at least 3 years to wait in Europe before you are legally allowed to call it whiskey. So while the whiskey rests or the spirit rests in the casks to become whiskey, they do gin for a turnover, just to have some money coming in, not just spending money and waiting for the whiskey. So therefore, in Scotland, each distillery does its own gin just to keep going until they wait for the whiskey. And therefore,
Mhm.
gin exploded in Scotland. Each small distillery has its own pot still, just dedicated to gin.
And
And I
maybe
think
that's how the craft gin revolution also started in a way.
absolutely. I mean, if you look if you look at the German language areas where I'm in here, you brought in Monkey 47. I think Monkey 47 was how to say, helped all the gins here into birth, because it was two guys. One was a fruit distiller, and the other guy was a Nokia marketing manager in the
Yeah.
US, Alex,
Mm.
before he came back to Germany, because he's German and his father was a spirits producer. And he came from America and he got all those dry martini culture with him, and said when he returned, I'm going to make a gin. And like Germans or German speaking people are, the reaction was, what the hell are you going to make gin? So, and he did a great product, which boosted into the market. And then all the other distillers, I mean, if you look at Germany and Austria, fruit distilling is the history. So lots of people
Yeah.
have pot stills. In Austria, we have about 120,000 licenses for small scalers which are allowed to distill, and they are all allowed to do gin. So they saw what Monkey did and said, hey, what that guy's doing, I can do at least myself. So they all started trialing, making their own gins. And I think that
Mhm.
is how that gin boom here in German language areas exploded in a very
Mhm.
short time. And that's the
Yeah.
same in Scotland, that's the same everywhere. And well, I'm not sure how it is in India, but I do
Oh, we
quite a
do
lot of.
have a lot of. Have you tasted any of the Indian gins? I think you have.
I
The
do
good
believe I
ones.
had. Yeah, I mean, we had them in a blind tasting, so I don't know the names, but there was some
Yeah.
very good quality. Yeah,
Yeah. We have some very good quality gins, and one of them, which I really personally like, is called Hapusa gin. That's very good. It's got beautiful botanicals, especially sourced from Himalaya, and the distillation is very high. They're in a state-of-the-art distillery, and there are a couple of others like Stranger and Sons, which was also a part of the Spirit selection last year, and they won a medal. And I don't know if you remember this, but this particular Indian gin actually won a gold medal last year at the Spirit
yeah, I
selection.
can remember.
So we do have
Absolutely.
some, yeah, so we do have some really good gins coming out now, craft gins. But yeah, but we're still a long way from being called a really good gin producing country. That's still far off. But what are the latest experiments that's happening in the gin industry now, in gin distilleries that you can talk about or you've seen in recent times?
Well, I mean, we just recently, 8 weeks ago, we had the Swiss Gin Awards, and
Okay.
we had some international friends in, and when we looked at the scores, I must really say we had about first 8 or 10 places were Swiss producers, and it's not just Swiss that enter. I mean, we have equal Swiss and international products, and then was one international, and then again about 8 Swiss producers. So I think the quality standards we have here at the moment in Europe are very high. People learned
Mhm.
or know how to distill. They get their recipes right. I mean, the trend is always going away from hardcore gin because not everybody likes juniper. it goes more towards softer, fruitier stuff. And they're experimenting quite a lot. I think the news, the new wave we see coming from Britain is that there's a new trend for flavored gin, which is a new category that's not even somewhere in the legislation, which means they have a proper gin as a base, and then they add in like berries, like strawberry or raspberry, or like also orange. Sevilla orange was a big thing last year. Now I see
I think
rhubarb.
we did taste a lot of we while judging, we judged a lot of flavored gins as well. I remember that. I think it's a big trend. So there's a very interesting question from Gagan. He says, "Hey author, the question is more about tonics than gins. What do you think about flavored tonics, and if one needs to sacrifice on the quinine to accentuate the flavorings to shine?"
Hmm.
That's, I think, a very important question.
It's a very important and a very good question. I really must admit. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, we did last year. We always do a publication of the Swiss Gin Award results, and last year we got asked by the publisher, "Why don't you do something about gin and tonic?" And blue-eyed, I said, "Oh yes, sure, why not?" So we had the top 10 gins, and I strolled through the shop of my friend and took some tonics. And at the end, we had 9 tonics and 10 gins. So it was a quite intense Saturday morning having 90 gin tonics.
Wow.
I think quinine is very important. The less there is in, the more your tonic will become lemonade.
Mhm.
Also, I think it's quite important that it's real quinine and not just aroma.
Yeah.
I mean, if we talk about the standard tonics, there is still, I mean, Fever Tree and Fentimans and Schweppes, and the whole world chasing about Schweppes as being a bad thing. But I mean, it's the most sold tonic, and
It
whenever,
is, even in India.
absolutely, and whenever a producer tells me I have a problem with Schweppes, I tell him, well, you have a problem if your gin doesn't work with Schweppes, because each and every consumer has a bottle of Schweppes at home somewhere. So I think those classic tonics without any flavor, they should bring out the aroma of the gin. They shouldn't overpower the gin, but they should push the aroma of the gin. The drier, the better. I'm quite a dry drinker. I like very dry tonics. Then
Me too.
there are some medium flavored stuff. I had a beautiful South African tonic um, with fruit in. So you find lots of stuff. I took some tonic because we said we talk about it. I mean, this is the
Yes.
classical Mediterranean stuff you find. There's a little bit of add-on rosemary, or a little bit of add-on lemongrass or coriander or whatever. And I think if you have the right gin, it can support the gin quite well. And then there is a category of tonics I personally don't like because they are too intense. They have a
Which
very
one?
strong single flavor. Well, I'm not going to tell names. We have a tonic
Okay.
here in Switzerland, um, and that tonic has, how do you say, has a special root in gentian root. And the bitterness not only comes from the quinine, but also from gentian root. But that gentian root is always present. And whenever you add that tonic to a gin, you always can say it was that explicit tonic, but there's nothing else from the gin. And another thing is there is some hibiscus tonics on the market. They are very flowerish, and they are like hibiscus lemonade. But I think they add too much of their own mantra to the gin. So a bone dry tonic might be a good thing. I'm not sure if you ever heard about. At the moment, I like this tonic quite a lot. It's a really a dry one. It's new from new. It's from France. No, it's from Spain,
Okay.
but it looks French, and it's a bone dry tonic which supports each gin equal.
Okay.
So I think that's the point. If you want to discover new things, I think that's the difference between whiskey and gin. I, I want to tell you more about that. But if you have 3 tonics and 3 gins and 3 garnishes, you're good to go because you have 3 by 3 by 3, so you have 27 different versions of your gin tonic. Whereas with whiskey,
True.
you always need a new bottle. So that's why people like gin.
Mhm.
And you really can experiment with having 1, 2, 3 tonics at home and 2 or 3 garnishes.
Yeah. I think East Imperial is also a very good tonic. Do you like the style of East Imperial?
East Imperial, never heard.
Yeah.
No,
It's
is
from
that
New Zealand.
New Zealand? Okay.
Yeah, it's an interesting tonic water brand which has been in India for some time. We do have some Indian tonic waters which are, I mean, not Indian tonic, but I mean Indian producers who are making tonic water, which are quite good actually.
Mm.
So
Have
now
you ever
talking about tonic water,
have you ever made your own tonic?
no, never. I
No,
should actually. Yeah,
you should. You
it's
should
just I should try it possibly. Just
definitely.
quinine, sugar, and maybe soda.
It's quite easy. You take a liter of water and you
Okay.
dissolve about 600 grams sugar. So it's quite high sugar content. We're going for a syrup.
Mhm.
You can take half white and half brown sugar, and then you put it on the oven and you heat it up until the sugar is dissolved. And then you add in 3 stalks of lemongrass and the skin and the juice of 3 lemons.
Okay.
And then you need obviously some quinine, so quinoa bark. Um,
Okay.
30 grams should do it. So 30 grams quinoa bark on that liter, and then you let it lightly simmer, cook for about 25-30 minutes. And at the
Mhm.
end, you add about 50 grams citric acid. That's that's a how do you say powder, powdered citric
Mhm.
acid.
Mhm.
And then you simply take off the solids and you cool down the liquid and you have a syrup. And you need 1 to 2 centiliters of that syrup on a fair measure of gin and only need to add soda water.
Oh. I think I'm going to try that. But the biggest problem is going to be sourcing the quinine bark from somewhere. Have to find that
Um,
out.
yeah, well, yeah, you can source it online. You can buy it in online shops like Amazon, or you simply go to your uh, drugstore. Drugstores sell it.
I'll try and do that. It's a nice experiment. So,
I send
which
you
are
the
you?
recipe.
Yes, please do that. I think that would be great. Um, so, which are the most popular gin brands for you right now in Europe? You think top five or top three?
In Europe,
Yeah.
well, I think the most sold gin brand still overall. Um, well, there's a Spanish brand called Ginebra San Miguel, which is big in the Philippines. It's the most sold brand worldwide. It's the #1 brand, and I think
Mhm.
outside Spain and the Philippines, you have no good chance to get hold of a bottle. It's dirt cheap.
Mhm.
Beside that, I think Gordon's is the most sold gin overall.
Okay.
So Gordon's still.
Yeah.
If you talk about the famous brands by numbers, I don't have the numbers on hand, but I think Hendrix is quite in front of that, ahead of the thing. Monkey 47, since they are with Pernod Ricard,
Mhm.
um, and Beefeater, which is a classic.
Okay. So, my friend, she is also online and she is asking a question that in the current times of lockdown in India, which easily available home ingredients would you recommend to pair with our favorite gin in case we don't get tonic water? Okay. If you don't have tonic water, then what would you do? I mean, how would you make a good
we
drink?
we got we got we got introduced once in Britain to a British favor. If you don't have tonic, they simply use Sprite.
Sprite. Oh yeah, I think Sprite was
Um,
that's a very but home ingredients. Anything else that can be used to make a drink?
well, possibly my home ingredients are different than hers. I mean, what you always can do is you take some gin, a fair measure of gin and some ice, and simply add in some lime and possibly other ingredients you have at home, like some garnishes, and that's it. If you're good to go and you have some Angostura bitter, you can make a proper pink gin, because pink gin is
Yes.
the original gin cocktail. What also you can do is, and I know citrus fruits are quite widely available in India.
Yeah.
What you can do is you can make your own gimlet, which is quite
Hmm.
easy. You take 4 centiliters of gin and a spoon of um, well, you can add sugar. The problem is commonly you should use a simple syrup. So you take 1 part water, 1 part sugar, and dissolve it to mix. So you take some gin and then you add 2 centiliters lime or lemon juice and a little bit of sugar syrup and stir it on ice, and you have a perfect gimlet.
There you go. Great. Thank you for that. Okay, so where
Thank you, pink gin shall be tried tonight. That's great.
yeah. In fact, when you're mentioning the pink gin, you can also add 10 ml of Campari to that because I've tried it. I think Campari also works quite well in that, gin, soda, and Campari form, and slightly, simple syrup or something if you would like to add.
Yeah, that
Even that
gives.
combination works well. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's the slim version of a Negroni. Possibly
Yeah.
something you're not having at home in India in each household, but it's an equal parts of gin, Campari, and vermouth.
Vermouth.
So
Yeah.
red vermouth,
Getting vermouth is a problem in India. I think vermouth
is it?
can be replaced with red wine, maybe, possibly. Few ml of red wine should work. Tonic wine,
Well,
maybe.
in that case, I'd rather leave away the wine and just take the Campari and the gin.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
not
That's
sure
what I
if
did.
the wine. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Do you
Yeah.
have Lillet? Lillet?
No, the problem is since the lockdown, there's nothing
Hmm.
available in India, and unfortunately, I don't have a vermouth at home right now. So
Okay.
that's something I'm regretting. I should have my
That it seems to be
martini.
different in India than here, because here all even explicitly spirits shop has been open because they are system relevant.
Of course, it's
So
an essential good,
yeah, yeah,
not in India.
definitely.
Yeah. So, but great. So, but where do you think gin is moving forward? How is it? Like, which are the latest big markets for gin? Like you mentioned, South Africa is making huge quantity of gin, and there's so many popular brands that you mentioned. Some of them being sent to you. So, which are the countries, and what is the latest trend that you see for gin? I mean, the future for gin.
What is the future of gin? I think that's a very direct and again a two-folded question. I mean, what I can see in the market, what we can see in tastings, is gin and gin, classic gin and modern gin. And the problem at the moment I see as a death nail or a coffin nail for gin is that gin is very popular, and each one thinks doesn't matter what's inside the bottle as long as I state it's gin, it sells. And I think I had a tasting weeks ago before the lockdown, and someone said, "You need to take this gin into the tasting. This is great. It's an Indian gin, and it has Granny Smith apple inside." I thought, "What the fuck?" So, I mean, I'm old enough. I'm old enough to had those 80 wave when in Europe those sour beverages were very high. I mean, we had those sour apple and sour whatever. So literally, it was nothing else than sour apple liqueur, and it was in a green, in a frog green bottle saying gin Granny Smith. So I think that's really the coffee nail for gin. The more
Mhm.
people start producing stuff that is not gin and sell it as gin, that's the bad thing. On the other side, I see beautiful variations of gin, even around the whole legislation, because in Europe you need to use pure ethanol as a base. But lots
Mhm.
and lots of countries start producing gin on a base spirit they simply produce themselves. I mean, you know our friend Christian
Yeah.
from the Calvados region. He does a gin based on a white Calvados spirit, and it's called Le Gin. And lots of producers do it that way, and it adds a complete new world. I mean, still uh, hardcore gin drinkers might argue it's not gin because legally it isn't, but people like that stuff. It has the character of the distiller, it brings in more different flavors. Again, goes away from the core idea of gin. But
And what about drinks like Fair Williams and apricotine? Could gin be taking that uh, side as well, you think? You have the fruit brandy style little bit because people are experimenting with all kinds of gin. So that could possibly be the future as well.
well, it's that that happens already here. I mean,
Mhm.
they they do distill gins. They make a beautiful gin base, and then they simply add in some fruit distillates, like wild-grown fruits, like rowan berry distillates, or even apple or pear distillates. Um, some base it on that, and some make a gin, a proper gin, and simply add it in afterwards. So that's always in which direction you want to go.
Mhm.
Keeping it pure as a gin, then you need to make a gin and add it in afterwards, or
Mhm.
experiment and take, say, apple spirit and add the botanicals and distill from that.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Arthur, for spending time on a Saturday afternoon.
It's been a
And
pleasure.
it was wonderful to talk about all these, gin trends and styles and cocktail tips and tonics. And I'm like really happy to discuss the tonics and styles of tonics as well because that's something everybody asked. That was a great question that, how important is the quality of tonic water? Because that I've always been saying that it's one of the most important things actually when it comes to drinking gin. So thank you
Yeah,
so much. Lovely to see you again and hope to meet you again soon. Hopefully in
absolutely. So
I know
where
end
do we
of the
catch
year
up
maybe.
next?
I don't
Belgium?
know, maybe in Belgium. I don't know. We'll
Let's
see.
hope so.
But thank you so
Okay.
much. Yeah,
Thanks very,
thank
very
you.
much. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
Rojita.